Our next agenda item is National Languages Funding Model. So I'm going to invite Julia Candish, Director of Education, and Ogimog Duke Pelche to come and do the presentation on National Languages Funding Formula. Ogima?
Yeah, there you go.
I got a loud voice too.
Yeah, I know that. So I'd like to call the assembly attention up here. My name is Vera Paywas Tababadang, and I'm the speaker today. And I'd like to introduce you to Ogima Duke Pelche and Julia Candish. They're going to do the presentation on National Languages Funding Model. Miigwech Duke. Ogima Pelche.
Hani bojo, yamak, yetsijik, bezdagejik, gima Duke Pelche, any Indigenous, Kwando dem, Wikwemkong, gima ondao, Benawage, Mandan Schnabim win, Duntkitan, Kinwanje. So I welcome everyone here to listen in on the presentation. And I'm going to ask for your consideration also as chiefs in assembly to confirm with our speakers once the presentations are done to have the resolution that's being put forward as part of this presentation here and this is the language enforcement, a defined and enforceable right resolution for you to provide some approval for that to happen. So I want to thank the staff of the Chiefs of Ontario as well as the Assembly of First Nations who's worked beside me in my role as the portfolio holder for the Chiefs Committee on Languages for the Chiefs of Ontario. I'm also, as a result of that, a member of the Assembly of First Nations Chiefs Committee on Languages. And what a great opportunity for myself to be able to participate in these discussions with government agencies and seeing the fact that the federal government itself has finally brought forward legislation to support language retention, revitalizations in all of our communities. It's too much chattering. Quit it. I'm very quiet when you're talking. That was my joking Mad's voice. But with the enactment of the Indigenous Languages Act in June 2019, the federal budget allocated funding for the Indigenous Languages and Cultures program for years 2023 and beyond. In order to make this funding accessible to First Nations, we are required to develop a First Nations language funding model, which will be used to inform a Treasury Board submission. To this end, the AFN Chiefs Committee on Languages and the AFN Technical Committee on Languages were given a mandate to work with First Nations to develop this funding model. Over the past year, the AFN and its Languages Committee have been drafting the First Nations languages funding model based on input from the various engagement sessions that you and many of your community members may have been a part of that took place throughout Ontario as well as across the country. The AFN is planning on bringing a resolution forward at the National Assembly in July to obtain approval for the final draft. Although the language model, the funding model, will impact languages funding provided by the Department of Canadian Heritage, it's important to note that the funding provided through the Indigenous Languages and Cultures program does not support kindergarten to grade 12 education in First Nation schools. The Chiefs of Ontario Leadership Committee on Languages is currently conducting research on immersion programs and models that will inform recommendations to address the much needed language and cultural supports that we've been needing for many, many years. The Leadership Committee on Language has also established 2 task teams focused on the implementation of Article 14 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and as well as the exploration of the various legal options that we could consider for the redress of language loss for all of our communities. We've seen the models lately in regards to child welfare and day schools and day scholars and residential schools. So these are the things that we are consulting with within our team, as well as with legal counsels, to determine whether that's an approach that needs to be employed to ensure that appropriate and dedicated funding is provided for us to enhance our languages, conserve them, revitalize them, and to continue hearing them amongst our children and throughout the community. And in fact, the task team on the implementation of Article 14 assisted in drafting a resolution. We've been drafting for the last 2 weeks. We missed the deadline, which is why I'm asking for your consideration as chiefs here in Assembly for a resolution to be considered as part of this presentation. Because the resolution before you deals with our languages, defining it as an enforceable right under UNDRIP. The Indigenous Languages Act, as it's currently written, only provides a mechanism to take forward a Section 35 challenge. And we feel, with the conversations we've had with legal counsel, is that if an amendment was put forward in the Indigenous Languages Act to include specific references to Article 14 of UNDRIP, we would have more of an enforceable right and opportunity to hold the government accountable. So this resolution calls on Canada to work with us to amend the existing Indigenous Languages Act to integrate all aspects of Article 14 and make these rights enforceable in the Canadian courts. Chiefs of Ontario Director of Education, Julia Candelish, will provide more information on the work of the Leadership Committee on Languages after the presentation by our friends here from the Assembly of First Nations Learning and Languages sector. And they'll be providing us an update on the First Nation language funding model. So please let me welcome our friends from the Assembly of First Nations. Thank you.
Miigwech Ogamapalche, and everyone. My name is Renee Saint Germain, and I'm a member of Rama First Nations, and I'm the Director of Languages and Learning at the Assembly of First Nations.
And good morning, everyone. Again, thank you very much for having us here today and inviting us to your territory to do this presentation. My name is Julia Stockdale-Terrell, and I'm the Associate Director of Languages and Learning. Miigwech.
So we are here to talk to you today about the First Nations language funding model. And as was explained in the opening, the reason for that is that we will be bringing a resolution to the AFN Chiefs in Assembly in July for ratification to look at the funding model. And this work is really around the passing of the Indigenous Languages Act, which called for sufficient, consistent, and long-term funding. So in 2021, Resolution 10/2021, support for a distinctions-based Indigenous language funding model was passed by the AFN executive, which called on the Technical Committee on Languages and the Chiefs Committee on Languages to work to developing a First Nations language funding model. And so this work is part of our co-development work with Canadian Heritage, and it's needed to go into a Treasury Board submission, and that's needed to unlock Budget 2019 funding for 2023-2024. So we have been sitting at a table called the Joint Implementation Steering Committee that does include MNC and ITK, but we are working on a First Nations language funding model to bring for ratification in July. And so this funding, as previously mentioned, just looks at the funding provided through Canadian Heritage, and it does not include K-12 funding for our First Nations students attending school on reserve. So I just want to make that clear as well, because that is a big distinction within the funding model.
So just to give a little bit of background on where we were and where we're going. So for quite some time, the Aboriginal Languages Initiative was the program within which language funding flowed. And it had several issues that have been identified by First Nations over the past few years. Namely, one, the funding was insufficient, approximately $5 million back in 2018. Some of the barriers with the proposal-based model included, one, just it was administratively burdensome. Sorry, I'm going to speak a little bit louder. And it was very time-consuming for folks to do these applications. This resulted in a lot of proposals either not happening in time, not getting the funding in time, or having insufficient funding to do the work needed for a long-term plan. Now, that program sunset in 2020 after the passing of the Indigenous Languages Act, and today there's the Indigenous Languages component. In budget 2019, $333.7 million was provided for language funding for languages, and this flows now through the ILC. However, at this time, the funding is still insufficient to allow for ongoing or core-like funding. So this is one of the changes that we are looking to make. Just for a little bit more detail, you'll see on the table here the amount of funding, again, that was provided in 2019. An additional amount of funding was provided in 2021, in theory over 5 years. However, it's actually limited to really 3 years condensed for the Indigenous languages component. For Section 8 and 9 agreements, this is the first time funding has been made available for Section 8 and 9 agreements, and this was created through the Indigenous Languages Act. Originally, it was also provided over the first 3 years, but it has been reprofiled to extend a little bit beyond, just to ensure that folks have a chance to learn more about these agreements and to make those applications.
So in terms of our timeline, as mentioned, the resolution to do this work was passed in summer 2021. And then throughout the fall and into the winter, we worked with the technical committee on languages to develop concepts for the funding model. We then held a series of engagement sessions, which were divided regionally, and a language funding forum. This was all to seek input and feedback on the work that we were doing and to make sure everyone was staying updated on the work. This isn't to say that we didn't use any existing information. We do know that there were several engagements held prior to the passing of the Indigenous Language Act. So wanting to take all that good information that we have as First Nations have consistently done throughout the years and build that into the work that we're doing now. So some key elements of the languages, of the First Nations language model is to unlock that funding. So we're talking about roughly 115 million annually for all distinctions, including the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages. So without a funding model, this money will remain locked. And that's not an unusual piece that comes out of the budgets. It's that often there are stipulations that come with budget announcements. And this was one of them for the DCH to work with First Nations and other distinctions on creating the funding model. The funding model also provides our ask, and we will continue to put forward a budget ask. And we've estimated at this point 14 billion over 10 years to support our First Nations languages. And this is included in the funding model. We know that First Nations languages right now through DCH and through ISC are both drastically underfunded to really reclaim and revive our languages. And that's something that's very important, obviously, to us as First Nations. And I can say, standing here before you today, that I do not speak my language. And it is something that I wish I did. So this funding is very important for our future generations, but also for our people like me and others. So there would also be a shift from proposal-based funding into long-term funding through the funding model. There is still a place for proposal funding that exists, but it exists in a very short term for limited time projects. But many of us do need funding ongoing to support the vision that we have for our First Nations and our languages. It includes a 3-year review as the funding model will be interim to unlock this funding. The funding model is based off of the amount that's currently available through DCH. But as mentioned, if there is significant more investments into First Nations funding, that would cause for the conversation to change. So some key concepts of the funding model are sufficient ongoing, sustainable, and long-term funding, the transfer of funding to support language revitalization and to increase First Nations control of First Nations languages, to help support urban and rural areas in First Nations languages, and to ensure that First Nations can transfer funding to agents. And when we speak of agents, we mean work with different organizations that help support language revitalization.
So now we just want to go into a bit more detail on what the different components are of the funding model. So again, proposal-based funding is what has been the general way that funding has been provided for languages. In this funding model, what's being proposed is that there be a shift, as Renee mentioned, towards ongoing programmatic funding. So that's funding that doesn't have to be applied for every year. And Section 8 and 9 agreements as provided through the Indigenous Languages Act. And then again, maintaining some proposal-based funding just to support time-limited community-based initiatives or to support new applicants who haven't been involved in language revitalization before but want to become involved. So this is a visual just to demonstrate a little bit what the 3 streams of funding are. So again, Section 8 and 9 agreements, ongoing funding, and proposal-based funding. For here, you'll see that the funding frequency is defined, the requirements to access the funding, and then the desired outcomes from each stream. So for Section 8 and 9 agreements, they would be time limited based on the negotiated agreement. For the requirements, it's a negotiation between an individual First Nation or a group of First Nations or a First Nation organization and the federal government. Provincial and territorial governments can also be brought in to an agreement if desired by the First Nations. We have, within the funding model, it states that a provincial government or other federal departments should not be able to have agreements without support or initiation by First Nations. For ongoing funding, again, this would be more long-term. A work plan or a language plan may be required just for let's say a 10-year agreement. And then finally, again, there's that proposal-based funding, annual or multi-year. Those currently exist within the ILC, and a proposal would be required. Though, again, the proposals that currently exist are very burdensome, and they do need to be streamlined to become more accessible. And ultimately, altogether, this the aim is to support First Nations-led language revitalization, reclamation, preservation, maintenance initiatives. So ongoing programmatic funding. I just wanted to go over each of the components in a little bit more detail. So ongoing programmatic funding refers to support that covers basic or core organizational costs. So that could include salaries, staff, facilities, governance. This is extremely important and one of the priorities of moving away from proposal-based funding because language initiatives take a lot of time. We are looking at a long-term vision. We're not looking at time-limited projects only. And to really support communities and ensure that First Nations can plan and actually have the funding required to support that on a long-term basis, rather than being limited by the program's design. And again, these would not require a proposal in the same way as proposal-based funding. And unfortunately, it has not yet been implemented due to limited funding. And because the funding is unlocked, which is one of the key priorities of the funding model, is to unlock existing funding that would be available for 2023 and 24 and future years, which amounts to about, at this stage, 75 million for all three distinctions. And that is why the funding model is also accompanied by a new funding ask of the 14 billion over 10 years. So again, Section 8 and 9 agreements are new. They were created through the Indigenous Languages Act. First Nations, individual First Nations or groups of First Nations and First Nations organizations involved or with a mandate for language would be able to enter into these agreements. These agreements, again, could be tripartite with a provincial government and the federal government if desired. The main focus of these agreements and how they differ from ongoing funding is that they focus primarily on collaborative initiatives and essentially ways to come together to support the development of speakers and fluency. Going back to that table we looked at earlier, funding has only recently become available through Budget 2021. So the funding model proposes that additional and new funding beyond the current 5-year limit is required so that First Nations can start to work with these agreements and see whether or not that works and works for First Nations, works based on the priorities, and if there are parameters that need to be changed and reviewed, as Renee mentioned, in the 3-year period. And finally, proposal-based funding, which is the most familiar as it is what is currently available, unfortunately is the only option at this time. So proposal-based funding would continue to be available, again, to support new applicants or to support time-limited projects. So for example, if somebody has ongoing funding, but they want to do a time-limited innovative project or try something new, this funding should be made available for that purpose without taking away from regular activities. and a proposal-based funding is available either on a multi-year basis or an annual proposal. It is expected that they will largely be phased out in preference for ongoing funding and Section 8 and 9 agreements, but we did hear throughout engagements that some proposal-based funding may be beneficial for a certain period of time. And finally, increasing First Nations control. So this goes beyond the three components or mechanisms for distributing funding. And this is more the principles behind what needs to change. So First Nations must have control over funding decisions. And there's been an increasing change over the years with the Department of Canadian Heritage becoming less operational and more administrative. So more taking a role of transferring the funding and less about making the decisions about who gets funding. There are two ways that this is starting to happen now. One, there's a First Nations Review Committee at the national level with language experts, with regional expertise, and then there are third-party organizations. This doesn't exist in every region, and there is a formal process for this with the Department of Canadian Heritage. So the funding model proposes that where First Nations decide, it will either be through the First Nations Review Committee, through these third parties, or directly with First Nations, particularly when it comes to agreements. Over time, we want to see this shift, and we want it to see it happen as quickly as possible, because the Department of Canadian Heritage, they don't have the expertise. They're not language revitalization experts, right? This isn't their work. It isn't their language, and therefore this is one of the priorities within the model.
So our next steps around this work, if the resolution is supported in July, would be to implement it. And part of that would be the continued co-development with the Department of Canadian Heritage on the Treasury Board submission to ensure that the First Nations voice and funding model is present and heard within the Treasury Board submission. It would be to continue to work with the Technical Committee on Languages and Chiefs Committee on Languages to support this work. DCH has also indicated that they will be doing a call for 23-24 to see interest for who would be interested in ongoing funding. So part of this would be language plans or work plans that are already developed and who has that work ready to move forward with ongoing funding. Additionally, through the Act and through our work at the AFN, we've advocated for a whole of government approach. So as mentioned, this does relate to the Department of Canadian Heritage funding, but there is also ISC funding and how we need to see languages as more holistically for our people. So that would be part of the implementation steps, as well as working with provinces and territories to encourage and see them support our language revitalization in our nations. There would also be further work to develop the terms and conditioning guidelines around language funding, which First Nations haven't always been part of through a government process. So ensuring that we are at the table and that the guidelines and any work that mandates how our languages funding is received, we have input into the work that's going into that, and we are driving that work as well. So those are some of the steps around implementation. So I do believe that is the end of our presentation, and I will be passing it over to Julia to talk about the coup side, but I just wanted to say miigwech, and it's really nice to be here in person with people, not over Zoom. So thank you for having us, and I do think we will take questions at the end.
Okay, yes, if we could bring up the Ontario region presentation. We really wanted to just be able to take a little bit of time to go over the activity that's occurring in the Ontario region to ensure that everyone was aware of what is taking place. So as Ogima Duke Pelche mentioned, we do have a leadership committee on languages that we work with at the Chiefs of Ontario, and they did take some time to review the languages funding model and had a little bit of input to provide on the proposed funding model, so considerations for the Ontario region. So some of the limitations that were raised by the Leadership Committee on Languages is that funding from Heritage Canada stems from the Indigenous Languages Act, which means that, and then there are issues with the Indigenous Languages Act itself, as Ogima Duke Pelche mentioned. It doesn't recognize our language rights. It only requires the federal government to consult with us regarding sustainable funding for language revitalization, and it does not guarantee funding, and it's dependent on the government and power to continue funding. As you've heard several times, it excludes funding for kindergarten to grade 12 schools. So Indigenous Services Canada is responsible for that funding, and we really do need something that's a little more holistic. There is currently no support for immersion schools, which are vital to language reclamation. And this is one of the reasons why the Leadership Committee on Languages and some of the chiefs have drafted the resolution that is going to be coming before you on recognition of our rights within the Indigenous Languages Act. Also, there is limited funding. We're working within a fixed funding envelope right now, which will not be able to fully address the needs of our communities. The other issue that it was mentioned in the AFN presentation is third-party administrators, and the model moves toward less control and decision-making for Heritage Canada, which is good, but it also promotes the use of third-party administrators for the Indigenous language component of the Indigenous Languages and Cultures program. And so the third-party administrators make decisions on the allocation of the ILC funding to recipients and makes decisions on the percentage of regional budget that's available for ongoing and proposal-based allocations. So we do have a third-party administrator in the Ontario region, which we had absolutely no input on the establishment of this third-party administrator. It's the First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers, and they were appointed by Heritage Canada in 2018. So that is a bit of a concern for us as well, as we have no relationship with them at the present time. When we look at, so what we're doing in the Ontario region is we've reestablished the Leadership Committee on Languages, and we also have spoken at length at the committee about regional languages coordination, because we have this third-party administrator within the Ontario region, which we really were not very aware of. We've been talking about this for quite some time, since we had a resolution at COO in 2017 talking about regional coordination through the Anishinaabeg, Mishkegwak, Ongwe Languages and Cultural Commission. Unfortunately, due to lack of funding, it's better known as AMO, was never reestablished. However, engagement with First Nations in Ontario has identified support for regional coordination. So the Leadership Committee on Languages is going to continue examining the need and function of a regional language coordination body for Ontario. So when we look at the COO Leadership Committee on Languages, as Ogima Pelche talked about, they have several priorities that they're looking at: the environmental scan on immersion programs, exploring, they have 2 task teams that they've established, one on exploring legal options for pursuing a legal claim for reparations and infringements and inequalities of First Nation languages, And then there's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Implementation Task Team. And this is the task team that was established to examine the articles of the declaration related to education and language and identify and recommend strategies on implementing the relevant UNDRIP articles. So the issue there, when we're looking at the implementation of the declaration, is, once again, there is no specific right recognized within the Indigenous Languages Act. There's no defined right, no enforceable right. There are no language rights to enforce, and hence no ability to require the Government of Canada to fund the implementation of our rights. It does not require the Government of Canada to move beyond consulting Indigenous peoples about the programming allocations. There is no right to publicly funded schools where our children can learn and learn in our own languages. And it doesn't clearly solidify federal obligations to Indigenous languages. So what the Leadership Committee on Languages has come up with as a solution is using the federal United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, using the Act to incorporate Article 14 and the other relevant articles of UNDRIP into the Indigenous Languages Act. And that is what, excuse me, that is what the resolution is about, that Ogima Duke-Peltier has recommended comes to the floor at this time. So certainly open to comments, questions, and I don't know if you want to speak any more about the resolution. Thank you.
So I wanted to say miigwech to the presenters and acknowledge the words that you have shared. Is there any comments or questions from our assembled leadership? Is there anybody online that has questions or comments? Microphone 4.
Morning, bonjour. Renee, hi. Good to see you. Chief Ted Williams, Chippewas Rama. A couple of years ago, I know that we had stepped out of, meaning COO, had stepped out of the kind of like the education component related to AFN. And so my question is that a hindrance or should we reconsider that? And when we're talking about languages in schools is what I'm thinking about, and working together. So it's just a question.
Julia?
Yes, that's a great question. Since I returned to my this position at the Chiefs of Ontario over a year ago, I stepped into that as a reality, in the fact that on education we were not participating at the national level. And so since then, we have done a lot of work to try and figure out how it is that we can repair those relationship, or that relationship between the Chiefs of Ontario and the Assembly of First Nations at the National Indian Education Council and the Chiefs Committee on Education. So we have put forward recommendations on repairing that relationship, and we're just waiting for a response from the AFN at this particular time. With regards to languages, we do still participate at the national level. So Chief Peltier participates in the leadership, or the National Chiefs Committee on Languages, and we do have a technical representative that sits at the Technical Committee on Languages. However, we don't participate at this particular time on education, and it is a hindrance for sure.
Thank you, Julia. Any other questions or comments? Any further questions or comments? Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, Ogama Pelche acknowledged it was a late resolution. It's Resolution 2218A. He asked the Assembly whether you're going to allow this resolution to be read into the record and put into the resolutions process. We talked the other day about how resolutions were going to be handled at the Assembly. And we let you know that the first 6 were received before the deadline, and the other ones after that were late. And in order to have those resolutions come on the floor of the Assembly, you are to give permission as the Assembly. So Ogama Pelche asked if you will consider Resolution 2218A. All of those that are opposed, raise your hand. Okay, I'm going to see Chief Shiny Turtles online and then microphone 2. Chief Shining Turtle.
Hello,
Good afternoon.
am I unmuted?
No, you're good. We can hear you. We can see
One
you.
way, okay. I support the idea of just bringing this resolution to the floor. Let's just get going. This is too important. The only thing I would say, it should be an all of government approach that deals with any of our issues. These partitions just don't work, miigwech. But I support bringing it forward.
Miigwech. Microphone 2.
Yes, it's a no-brainer. I concur with that. I think this is a vital importance to our people. So I think we should go forward with it.
All right. Is there any in opposition to this resolution coming forward? All of those in favor of the resolution coming forward on the floor, raise your hand. Online, raise your hand. We're good? Okay, so we're all good. We're all good. Everybody approves that this resolution can come forward. Now, when we talked the other day about resolutions like this that came forward and got approved would go right next after the 5, 6 that have been received. But in my common sense, it's been moved and seconded that we would go ahead and do this now, as I think our friend talked to. I'm just not, don't want to create no trouble here. Chief Shining Turtle, do you have a question or you just forgot to put your hand down on the virtual platform? Down now? Okay. Microphone 4.
Menong Gashap Kanawaya, Ogama Alanazal and MKs Gamak Nishnobek. Not disrespecting the agenda process that we've also agreed to as well too, but I understand that we will be voting on this resolution immediately with following this presentation. We do have 2 other resolutions in relation to that coincide with some of the discussion that's happened here today with the First Nation Resolution 2218A, First Nation languages, a defined and enforceable right, and Resolution 2216A. Resolution 2212A, affirmation of First Nation education sovereignty in response to interim funding approach and support for First Nation schools with collective. If I can humbly request as well too, if we can bring those to vote as well as in addition to this discussion and vote on this resolution. Miigwech.
I hear you. And we're ready to, we'll put that to the floor as well then. That those resolutions, again, your numbers? Okay. 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 So I hear you. I'll get back to you. I want to deal with this resolution that you have given permission to come to the floor. And I'm going to ask then that it's resolution 2218A. It's the First Nations languages, a defined and enforceable right. It's been moved by Ogama Duke Pelche, and the seconder is Grand Chief Abram Benedict from Makwasasni. Would the mover or seconder like to speak to the resolution? The mover or seconder like to speak to the resolution? Microphone 2.
Just some, I guess, need to say miigwech to the Assembly for having this opportunity for this resolution to be dealt with during the subject matter of the presentations. And I believe that I did cover off most of the points, other than if I did forget anything, was just to stress that under the Indigenous Languages Act, there is no reference to UNDRIP, and it's something that the legal that is supporting the technical table have flagged that if UNDRIP was referenced within the Indigenous Languages Act, that it would assist First Nations in having an enforceable option for funding. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Is there any further discussion on the resolution? Is there any further discussion on the resolution? The resolution as it's moved by Ogama Pelche and seconded by Grand Chief Abram Benedict, a number of whereases 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, and 7. Therefore, be it resolved that we, the Chiefs in Assembly, 1, agree that work in partnership between First Nations and the Government of Canada must begin immediately to amend existing Indigenous language legislation to incorporate Article 14 of UNDRIP and other articles of UNDRIP which mention Indigenous languages and ensure First Nations language rights are defined and enforceable. 2, request the Regional Chief to write a letter to the Department of Justice outlining this recommendation as a means to begin addressing the dire state of First Nations languages, as well as a first step for Canada towards their commitment to UNDRIP. 3, mandate the COO Leadership Committee on Languages, which is a subcommittee of the First Nations Education Coordination Unit, to determine how much funding is required to engage First Nations in Ontario to provide input into the development of the legislative amendments and any subsequent policy, regulatory, and/or funding requirements. 4, require Canada to provide funding to support First Nations engagement in this process to ensure a consensus is built. And 5, require that FNECU and/or LCOL to report progress on this initiative at every COO assembly until the mandate is achieved. That is the resolution as moved and seconded. The resolution is moved and seconded. The resolution is moved and seconded. The resolution is moved and seconded. All right, thank you. Question is called. All those against the resolution, raise your hand. If you're against the resolution, raise your hand. We don't have any on the platform against. Anybody abstaining from the resolution? Anyone abstaining from the resolution? Anyone abstaining from the resolution? All of those in favor of the resolution, raise your hand. We're all good. Resolution is carried. Miigwech. Miigwech, miigwech. My grandchildren will be so happy. Okay, so resolution, you have asked permission. From our package of resolutions, you have asked for Resolution 12A and Resolution 16A. I need direction from the chiefs for these resolutions to be introduced. They are late resolutions. We need a motion from you to accept. All right. Grand Chief Benedict has moved the motion. Chief Shining Turtle is on the platform. Chief Shining Turtle?
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for doing resolutions on education. In this instance, I have one dealing with the province of Ontario. Can we deal with that one as well then, since we're now in a potpourri of coup governance, I would call it. So there is one in there that I brought forward on use of English in the Ministry of Education curricula. Can we deal with that one as well, since we're dealing with education? It's a kind ask, given that we're now beyond the barriers of what was described as the process yesterday, and we were held to account on that yesterday. Miigwech.
Anything to move us forward. The resolution number, Chief Shining Turtle?
I have no idea. I got to leave that to the coup. I just sent them in. They would have to find it. It was on education. It was me and Chief Loraka, I believe, dealing with the English language in the Ministry of Education.
Okay, so we're going to get that resolution. We have permission. Do I have permission then from the chiefs that's been moved by Chief Benedict, including that resolution from Chief Shining Turtle, that we will include them in the package of resolutions that we're going to be dealing with? So it's moved by Grand Chief Benedict, second by Ogema Pelche, to bring those late resolutions forward and to be dealt with in the resolutions process. So question? Anyone opposed to the motion? Anyone opposed to the motion? Anyone opposed to the motion? Anybody abstaining from the motion? Anyone abstaining from the motion? And anyone abstaining from the motion? All of those in favor of the motion? That motion is to bring those three resolutions off the late table and into the group of resolutions to be dealt with today. All right, no opposition, no abstentions. That motion is carried. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech. Who's next? Lunch? All right, we got lunch. It's lunchtime. We worked ourselves right through to lunchtime, so let's do that. Enjoy your lunch. I know elders are going into their meeting this afternoon, and we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock soon as the drum calls us back in. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech.
All right, welcome back from lunch, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the break. At this time, I'd like to invite Chief Duckworth to come up to the front and have a discussion about the ministerial zoning orders. All right, so we'll give everybody a few minutes to get settled, and then we'll be getting started. Miigwech.
So ministerial zoning order is next, and justice, and we're probably going to have to take more of that place of resolution because it's going to be national chief. I guess so. We've got 1 o'clock, that national chief, 2 hours, 3 presentations. Because it's going to be an hour for sure. So, ministerial zoning orders. Yep. Justice. The national chief. I mean, if we have an hour to do OFNTSC, then we can do it, but we. All right. Well, let me get you now.
All right, thank you, everybody. We're going to get started now with Chief Duckworth.
I should shut my radar off. I see you on TV all the time. Finally get to see you in person. Test. Miigwech, everybody. I hope everybody had a good lunch. Lots of food today. And I'm very pleased to be able to come to the Chiefs Assembly today to speak to you about something that's called the Ministerial Zoning Order. And so I think we may be more familiar with orders in council, which is the federal level. And when you hear ministerial, that's Ontario ministries, right? So the ministerial zoning orders that have affected the First Nations in the last 4 years has grown. So for an example, well, I guess I should start. What is a ministerial zoning order? A ministerial zoning order is something that the province assigns to a project. So let's say I was building a big box store and I needed to get it built right away because the investors are waiting and we need to get it done right away and winter's coming. So we want to be able to start the build. So what would happen is Ontario government sends down to the municipality a request for a ministerial order. The municipality votes on it, sends it back to Ontario, and at that point, it's set. So there's no appeals, there's no recourse. So once the ministerial order has been granted, there's no way for First Nations or anybody to appeal it. So since the Ford government came into power, I think there was 62, I might be off by a few numbers, ministerial order, zoning orders ordered over the last 4 years of the Ford government. The whole 10 years prior to that, there was 4 that had been issued. So why are we concerned about a ministerial zoning order? When the province issues a ministerial zoning order, what happens is there's no duty to consult at that point. At that point, there's no archaeology, there's no benefit agreement, there's nothing that can be done. So I want to just tell you about a personal experience that Caldwell First Nation just had, so that maybe collectively we can discuss it and figure out a way forward, because I'm understanding that in the north, there are even more of these being issued. So what had happened is, in Windsor, Ontario, which is a traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederation, Caldwell, shared by Walpole, that's our area. So what happened is, we understand right now that southwestern Ontario does not have enough energy, enough hydro to be able to continue to feed all of their citizens and their businesses. So we know right now, Honey is deep into negotiations with the First Nations in the South. That aside, we know that battery power is going to be the way to go. Battery storage, battery powered, battery plants is all coming to the Southwest. And what we've found is these big companies like Stellantis have gotten into joint ventures with other large companies. So it's not just one company that's coming into the territory. They've actually aligned, and there's three and two different big companies. When I say that, I mean Mercedes, I mean Ford, have joint venture agreements with these big producers of energy. So we had gotten notice. Well, first of all, about a month and a half ago, there was a big announcement in the Windsor paper saying that Stellantis, the battery factory, was coming to Windsor. It's a $4 billion project, and Windsor's really happy. Doug Ford was there, Trudeau was there, so it's a big deal to Windsor, and we understand that it's a big deal. So we had been receiving consultation. We have a consultation department, and we were getting consulted, and when it gets to a certain point, that's when leadership comes in. So we knew Stellantis was coming, even though, you know, nobody shared it with us from the municipality or the government. So then what happened was we received one letter to get ready to start to engage, and then we received a letter that a municipal zoning order was being asked for by Ontario, by the Windsor City Council. So we found out on a Tuesday, and we got ourselves on the agenda for the municipality on a Monday. But Caldwell First Nation wasn't alone. Jason Henry, Chief Jason Henry from Kettle and Stony Point is also there to help with this matter. Chief Jackie French was, and her team was there. And what I see happening eventually is the Confederacy being able to manage this. But at this time, we're looking for some support. So we went to, we got into Windsor, into their council meeting, and they're not meeting in person, everything is on Zoom. And so we were held, our delegation included two chiefs, the Grand Chief, sorry, I'm forgetting about Joel Abram. He was there, he was on the phone, and he was there on Zoom to support us, AI. So what happened was we were, I was given a minute to speak, and then Kettle Point was given a minute to speak, and then OKT was there, but they were having bad reception, so they shut it down. And so the other people that we had there, our technicians who were going to be a part of it, all listed, were silenced. I put my hand up, it was taken down. I was silenced at their table. So, but when I did speak, I asked them if they would consider, tabling their motion and bringing it back at their next council meeting so that we could educate them and speak to them about how this is going to impact the First Nations. There were a few councillors that asked questions. I answered them. Their legal that was there gave bad advice, and I'm not a lawyer, but I do know some stuff. Because they're not prepared to deal with us. They have no idea how to speak to us, how to deal with us. So they went on and they voted it through. So the three nations right now are aligned, and what we're going to do is we are going to do a judicial review. So a judicial review is when you go to the settler courts and you say there was failure to consult, and then you provide all the evidence. It's a really high bar. You have to have a lot of good evidence in a judicial review to win it. It's not like we consider other lawsuits. For some reason, judicial reviews have to be proven. And there's very few of them that win, but we're prepared to go on. So that being said, what I've come today is, because it's an Ontario issue, that we need to address it. So why Caldwell wants to address it? Well, there's a $4 billion project that's coming, and we also know that there's 4 other projects scheduled to come into the territory. So what do we have? We have loss of land, loss of consultation, loss of any ability to get any equity because of a ministerial order was granted. So I think that those MZOs are very destructive to our people. It's an Ontario issue, and we're federal under the settler law. So I'm coming to the chiefs in Ontario so that we can deal with this in Ontario. I know it's been dealt with by BC or by the Squamish Nation. You have the briefing note. So I just wanted to set the stage for what's been happening, and I'm going to turn it over to Larry Salt. So who's Larry Salt? Larry Salt is the intergovernmental and business affairs person for Caldwell First Nation. And for most of you, he needs no introduction. But I think it's important to be able to have the ones with the experience at our back, the ones that have already done the fights, the old voices. I'm a young chief. I'm not young, but I'm a new chief. I was elected in 2018 and I was removed by my council. I was elected in 2019 and I was removed by my council. I was elected in 2021 and the nation removed the council because it was only me, the chief's job, that was running. Because we have a custom election code, we don't fall under the Indian Act there. So I'm finally here at the place I wanted to be in 2018 to be able to speak about our issues as First Nations people, as governments. We are leaders of lands and people, the lands and the people. So the lands are being threatened by the Métis and MZOs. The people are being threatened by the MZOs and the Métis. So I say that in open council or an open meeting because there are issues that we need to address as chiefs. And I think after listening to our last meeting, I concur with the chief that says we need to talk about this openly. There are no secrets. We all in our own community say transparency, transparency, transparency. So I'm here to say I look forward to addressing this issue and the other issues. And I say Miigwech for giving me this time because I know it is a busy, busy agenda. Thank you. Sorry. Is there any questions for me? Not seeing any? Perfect.
So I'm just going to ask Larry to come up and speak first, and then we'll address some questions and comments following that. So at this time, Larry Salt.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to stand with Caldwell First Nation as their intergovernmental relations and big business development. I have a long history with Caldwell, dating back to when, I suppose, when they were called a near band and trying to get recognized as a First Nation under the Indian Act. So it's my pleasure to work with Chief and Council of the Caldwell First Nation, particularly on political issues and big business in their traditional territory. This morning, I want to just reiterate what I heard 2 or 3 times, and that was, "We're too nice." Was quoted several times this morning. And when I was a chief back in the 90s, I thought we were too nice back then. And here we are in 2020 now, and we're still too nice. I wanted to just maybe remind us that the Ford government in Ontario was just re-elected to an even bigger majority than he was elected 4 years ago. And what does that mean for First Nations? What does that mean for our communities here in the province of Ontario? It may mean we have to take a stronger stand and not be so nice. You'll remember 4 years ago when the Doug Ford government was elected, he unilaterally killed a number of energy projects within our region. Some of them were very, very lucrative for our First Nations. And on a unilateral level, he uses his orders in council to do the very thing he's doing today when the chief talks about 64 MZOs versus 4 prior to him, 10 years prior to him coming into office. So I wanted to say that in order to challenge our thinking in terms of where we are with this government here in Ontario and maybe what measures we're going to have to take. Just in terms of the chief's conversation about the Zoom call. Actually, this project is a $5.1 billion project, and they're suggesting it's going to create 2,500 jobs on 230 acres of property. What does that do for the First Nation? They don't have the First Nation in mind. We were told that the city of Windsor has never had to be challenged by a First Nation. This is the first time that they've had to experience the challenge of a First Nation, because obviously we are out of sight and out of mind. And we need to change that. We need to change that attitude, out of sight, out of mind. We know that a year ago, this conversation at the regional chief elections, that was raised, ministerial zoning orders was raised a year ago. And I'm not sure what has happened with that process since that time, but I know that there are individual First Nations that are faced with the same issue. The other day when we started to talk about the discussion, what do we do from here? Where do we go from here? I thought that maybe we could do something as a class action, but that's not the route to go, because each of us have our individual issues that we have to deal with. And there's a legal process, as I understand, that we need to go through. On top of this specific project, we know and are very much aware that other international companies like Mercedes is targeting Windsor. We understand that there's 2 Korean companies who are JVing, joint venturing with General Motors in the Windsor area. And we understand that Nissan and Toyota and Mitsubishi also have joint ventures in place. So in terms of the Caldwell First Nation and this MZO issue now, this is bigger, bigger, bigger than just one project. And if they can get away with the one, they'll go on to the next and the next and the next. So Caldwell First Nation is asking for the support of the chiefs and assembly to move this agenda forward. And I know that we have to have a discussion in terms of where we go from here and how we take the challenge on of an MZO. And maybe it would be good to have support from those First Nations, whether it's through a letter writing to Caldwell First Nation in support of where we're going and how we move forward together. So Jimmy Gwetch just wanted to add those those issues, and I think that we're going to have a challenge over the next 4 years, and with Ontario, and what we do with Ontario specific. We have a map up somewhere coming up where that identifies the 64. There we are. Those are the MZOs as they presently are in Ontario at this point. So I'll leave it at that, Madam Chairman. Thank you. And Chief, thank you for allowing me to speak.
I'd like to thank Chief Duckworth and Larry Saul for their time and raising this important issue. Just to be respectful of presenters' times and invited guests as well as the chiefs, we are going to limit some questions and comments in order to keep the agenda moving forward. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge Mike Ford.
Bonjour, Guillaume Ted Williams, Chippewas Rama. The Williams Treaty First Nations certainly have had our experiences with MZOs down in Oshawa area. There was, in the Duffins Creek area, there was a big development that was taking place. And Williams Treaty intervened on that, led by Chief Kelly LaRocca. And so my understanding there was supposed to be a great big Amazon warehouse that was going to be taking place in this environmentally sensitive area. So the issues that we obviously are very concerned about is, the lack of consultation. Obviously, any hunting, fishing, and harvesting rights, whether it's south or whether it's in the northern part of Williams Treaty territory. We did successfully defend that particular issue, and they moved on. So take heart. There is going to be ongoing issues, ongoing challenges, and my advice is because we have a case or two MZOs in the area, in our local areas. Municipalities, the mayors, a few of the mayors have called me, and they've asked me, so like, what's your position on MZOs? And basically I said, it's a non-starter. It's not happening. If you're going that route, then you're going to have to consult with us, and we're basically no. And I come from it in an honest fashion as far as Rama is concerned, because when we developed the casino 26, 27 years ago, we had to jump through all kinds of hoops, right? A big development, they just wanted to just take the shortcut and without doing any consultation. And that's not right. We won't let it happen. And I urge all chiefs to get on board with this, because it's a very important issue, and we certainly support the Caldwell First Nation. Very much.
Thank you. All right, so I'm told that virtually we do have another hand up. So at this point in time, I'd like to turn it over to the virtual platform. Chief Pachana, you can go ahead.
Yep. I guess my question is to Caldwell First Nation and Larry, but I'm unsure exactly what the project is that I'm being asked to oppose here. Who is building the project, and what specifically is the project going to do? What are they trying to do? Is it a solar farm? Is it a wind farm? I'm not sure.
This clearly is not our project. We are opposing, not so much even are we opposing, we're asking the City of Windsor to come to the table with us to talk about the development and how the Caldwell First Nation can get involved in protecting our environment, protecting the lands, protecting everything, species at risk in and around Lake Erie and Detroit River. and making sure that everything is up and up in terms of consultation and accommodation. It is not our project. It is the City of Windsor, who, by the way, is partnering with the province of Ontario and the federal government. The federal government is obligated to support us in consultation and accommodations. And in fact, they are partners to the tune of $500 million each from the feds and the province on this project with the City of Windsor. So it's not our project, Caldwell First Nation. We are simply asking the city to sit down with us and talk about consultation and accommodation and what that means to us and how we get satisfied that our terms is met.
No, I understand that, Larry. I understand that. What I need to know is what is the development? I got no idea. All I'm hearing here is that there's development. What kind of development?
Yes, Chief Machano. So the development is a 230-acre property that will have a EV battery, a battery storage process on it. Huge.
Okay. I understand. So this is a battery storage project with that OPG is putting forward. I'm aware of those.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so in the interest of time, we do have one more comment virtually, and that is from Chief LaRocca. And I acknowledge the importance of this issue, and I thank Chief Caldwell,
Hello. I just wanted to, sorry, I'm on the phone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. I just want to, thank the chief for raising this issue on the floor. It's a deeply problematic issue, especially when you have constitutionally protected hunting and fishing rights, harvest in your treaty area, and MZOs are still being slapped over top of them. It's going to affect all of us. I think I'd be grateful if the Chiefs of Ontario could pass a resolution that, in support of this and some kind of, I guess, I don't know what you call it, some kind of table to come together and discuss it further with government, because they can't keep, running roughshod over our treaty rights that we work so hard to protect. And I don't think it's at all feasible or efficient to have to fight in court for every single MZO that comes into your area. They're just going to bleed us of resources, and they know it. So that's all I have to add. But thank you for your comments as well, Chief Williams.
Thank you, Chief LaRocca. So I think this is an important conversation, and suggest that this is something that we discuss at a further date or explore further. At this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Speaker Vera.
So I want to say miigwech, and I'd like to invite now our panel for the justice update on the collaborative table, Jackie Lombardi and Chief Stacy Loft on virtual platform, and she's the chair of the Justice Committee, and Kent Elson Advocacy. So Jackie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Elders, Regional Chief Hare, leadership, delegates, youth, technicians, the singers of the drums, and the sacred items before us. My name is Jackie Lombardi, and I am the Acting Director of Justice at Chiefs of Ontario. I'd like to begin by thanking the Independent First Nations for hosting this year's Assembly. I am very happy to be here today to introduce the Justice Update, which is on the tripartite collaborative technical table on the enforcement and prosecution of First Nation laws. I am joined today by the Justice Portfolio Holder, Deputy Grand Chief Stacia Law from AIAI, and Kent Elson, Legal Consultant helping the table's work, to deliver today's update on the inaugural year of the table to Chiefs in Assembly, as mandated by Resolution 2137. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Grand Chief Loft, who is joining us virtually to lead us in our update.
Sego, sewa gwego, wakano marado, Just like to say Bujuani to everyone in attendance today. I hope you can see my screen. So say go to all the chiefs, the deputy grand chiefs, the elders, the youth, delegates, and of course, any of those support persons that are helping this meeting continue. Ayawenji sewa takarite dano wakatsununikon ikes dano hos ganagoa with wakatsununikon esewes. Hello everyone. So just wanted to offer my greetings to you all and hope that you are all healthy. I'm happy to be here with you today, joining virtually, and happy that you are all here and were able to arrive safely. Yegahadake yangyats, kai gahagani wangoan joro, gandege nitawagenon dano segon gandege degiro. So my name is Stacia Loft, Deputy Grand Chief of AIAI. I'm from the Mohawk Nation and I'm joining you live from the shores of the Bay of Quinte here in Gandege, Tyendinaga. So I'm happy to be here today in my capacity as Justice Portfolio Holder in order to provide you an update, of course, on the first year of the tripartite collaborative table on the enforcement and prosecution of bylaws. First Nations laws. So some of you may be familiar with this table, and you may recall that it was the subject of a resolution in November of 2021. As part of that resolution, the Chiefs of Ontario received a clear mandate to participate at this table and also to report back to the chiefs in assembly. So this is what we're doing today, is to provide an update on the table's progress over this past year. So I'm going to begin first by providing some background information on the table, just to get folks up to speed for those who this may be new for. I'll also provide some information on who sits at the table, how the table functions or operates, and of course that progress to date. After that, I will then hand it off to Kent Elson, legal consultant who has been helping with the table over the past year to take us a little bit more in depth into the table's work. Hopefully, I know that we're crunched a little bit for time, so hopefully we'll have some time for questions after that. And of course, hear any guidance that you may have for the table as it moves into its second year of operation. So let's see if I have control of this. Can I change the slide? And I can't. Oh. So I don't know if someone can change the slide. I'm going to try to figure out how to do this. So I thought it was going to be super easy.
This is Lava.
Clearly not. Yeah.
You can just click on your presentation. It's going to go to the next slide, like you're sharing your screen. Just click. There you go.
Wow,
magic.
magic.
Presentation.
Here I am clicking the arrow buttons, thinking that would make logical sense. Clearly not. So here's a slide on our background. So just a little over a year ago, so around May 6th or so of 2021, the table was publicly launched. And involved in that launch was the former Ontario Regional Chief Roseanne Archibald, and also two former Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler, along with federal ministers Lametti, Blair, and Miller. So for those who may recall that, also to Ontario Attorney General Downey and Solicitor General Jones. So this table was created because there continues to be longstanding gaps in service for the enforcement and prosecution of First Nations laws. So this is something that we know, that we're familiar with, despite our laws being known to our own peoples and on our lands. So this table was developed to respond to these obstacles, to create some recommendations for solutions, and to ultimately get to a place of consistent and reliable First Nations law enforcement and prosecution. So it's the first of its kind in Ontario, and there are many eyes on this table watching progress. And so this table will continue to strive to work collaboratively and of course to engage in dialogue. So this is just a membership overview of folks who sit on this table. So it's important for me to emphasize that this table is a technicians table, and it's co-chaired by the Chiefs of Ontario through the Acting Director of Justice, Jackie Lombardi, the Ontario's Ministry of the Attorney General, the Assistant Deputy Attorney General Jane Mallon, and Department of Justice Canada Assistant Deputy Minister Laurie Sargent. Elder Barney Batiste and Elder Donna DeBossegay sit on this table, along with representatives from First Nations organizations, who you'll see here, who all play an instrumental role in guiding the work at the table. So the table also includes representatives from Ontario and Canada, ministries and departments, along with members with observer status. And these include Land Resources Center, IPCO, and the OPP. So here's the full list of names. And I believe you also to have this presentation available in your kits. So just wanted to provide a first year in review for you. So in its first year, the table has met 9 times. They started with developing first the table's terms of reference, which I'm sure the Justice Sector can circulate for those who are interested in that. We struck a First Nations working group to help provide a more coordinated First Nations representation at the table. The working group members are technical representatives from the PTOs, IFN, Six Nations, and Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. And once the work was underway, the First Nations working group presented to the table on the enforcement and prosecution barriers experienced in each member's region and within their communities. So the table thought that this was an important way to start off its work because it provided the space for the First Nations working group members to flag the obstacles that need the table's attention, while also to identifying possible solutions and paths forward. And again, we can circulate copies of this presentation and other documents for those who are interested. So in Resolution 2137 from last November's Special Chiefs Assembly, Chiefs in Assembly at that meeting demanded immediate steps to address the prosecution and enforcement gaps from the federal and provincial governments. This included funding for First Nations to enforce and prosecute their own laws, and making Crown attorneys available to prosecute First Nations laws on request by a First Nation. So these requests have been reiterated at the table by Regional Chief Hare, but we do not yet have a formal response. So we're waiting to hear back. So these are immediate solutions to reduce the gaps that are created by the lack of enforcement and prosecution, while discussion about these long-term solutions are ongoing, both at the table and between First Nations and the federal and provincial governments directly. So I know Kent is going to speak a bit more in detail on this when I pass it over to him. So the table was also, the table had also developed a work plan for its first area of work. And the First Nations Working Group decided that a phased approach to identifying barriers related to the enforcement and prosecution of First Nations laws and bylaws would be a good way forward. So studying the enforcement piece first, and then moving on to prosecution. And also having the study be law specific, so that the working group, they suggested by starting to focus on First Nations trespass laws and bylaws. The table is now working its way through this enforcement study on trespass laws. This included, as part of that process, examining the obstacles to the enforcement of trespass laws, identifying some possible recommendations to overcoming these barriers. And now the table is working on crafting some next steps for finalizing those recommendations. So the table will move into studying obstacles with the prosecution of First Nations trespass laws. So this is always important in terms of our learning process is what have we learned? So thanks to, of course, the generosity and the guidance of the elders that sit at the table, and of course the knowledge and expertise of the First Nations working group members who are so willing to share those experiences. The table has gained many valuable insights as part of this process. The table has learned that many of the barriers to the enforcement and prosecution of First Nation laws are deeply entrenched, layered, and of course complex. First Nations in Ontario are all unique and are in all unique situations. So not one community is the same as the other. And of course, this leads to varying needs and priorities. So this complexity and variety extends to the types of First Nations laws that First Nations are looking to have enforced. And because of this, the table recognizes that a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing barriers to the enforcement and prosecution piece of First Nations laws will not serve our nations in a meaningful way. So to that end, the collaborative table has learned that these principles of collaboration, flexibility, and creativity is essential for the table to be successful in meeting the diverse needs and priorities of First Nations across the province. So while also learning and respecting that what our nations are doing, as we have always done, I would hope, is that the work to revitalize our laws and legal systems, laws that have always existed and guided our communities. So we know that these exist. And the table fully acknowledges that it is for us, First Nations, who are leading the way to a future where our laws are enforced and prosecuted consistently and effectively to ensure the safety and well-being of our citizens and communities. And as part of that work, additional supports and solutions are required. So this table is an additional means of support to supplement those efforts and leading that path to get to a place of consistent and reliable law enforcement. So some next steps for the table. A major priority for this coming year will be to push for the immediate solutions outlined in Resolution 2137. Funding should be available immediately for us to prosecute our own laws, and Crown should not be refusing to help when asked. In addition, we plan to develop written recommendations based on the potential solutions and pathways that have been identified at the table, that are concrete, that are comprehensive and flexible. Those recommendations to overcome barriers that continue to be faced by First Nations in their efforts to enforce their trespass laws and bylaws. So there's, of course, still lots of work to be done. And the work plan charts a path forward, including a plan to continue to meet every 4 to 6 weeks. And so while work is ongoing to implement solutions to enforcement gaps, the table will start to study barriers to the prosecution and adjudication in infractions of First Nations trespass laws and bylaws. The table will also hear from all the parties involved in the prosecution and adjudication process in the Ontario region. And based on what is learned and unlearned through the process, prosecution and adjudication focus recommendations will be developed from that. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Kent.
Chimigwich, I've been told I have 13 minutes, so I will stay within that. It's an honor to be here, and I'm going to be discussing in a little bit more detail some of the gaps and some of the potential solutions to fill those gaps. And I think the slides are going to come back up on the screen, and hopefully I can control them here, but I'm happy to get started and use those for 13 minutes well. So I'll start with the enforcement gap. And the enforcement gap is the step that involves police. And the kind of enforcement gaps that you face depend on the kind of policing that you receive. So 20 or so First Nations are policed directly by the OPP, and generally speaking, the OPP flat out refuses to enforce First Nation laws. And the primary reason for that is they say that it's not their job. They say they're not responsible. But even if they're willing to look at it, they treat First Nation laws as being presumptively invalid and require First Nation laws to go under an extensive review process that they don't require for provincial laws or for federal laws. And that review process can take a very long time. And that review process may end up with them saying, we don't like this law, so we're not going to enforce it. And that's obviously a huge, huge problem and totally inappropriate, because it means that they are usurping the role of the First Nation, who's supposed to be writing the laws, and the role of the courts, which is supposed to be applying the laws. And if the OPP isn't enforcing a law, then it's just words on paper. Now, if you're policed by a First Nations police service, there is considerably more success in enforcement of laws by the police, but there are still gaps, particularly in terms of resources and concerns relating to liability and charter issues. And there is a particular focal point for these gaps, and that's Ontario's new policing legislation. And that new legislation sets out what police officers must do. So it has a list of the mandatory police functions. And it has a new section in it that specifically says that First Nation bylaws don't have to be enforced by police. And what that means is that the OPP are reinforced in saying, that's not our job. And what it means is that Ontario's, or the First Nation police services in Ontario won't be funded for this kind of work. Now, I'm going to come back to this when we talk about next steps. As you know, there's generally two steps in the enforcement process. First, the police do their part. There might be an investigation or an arrest, and then they lay charges. And then the second step, the prosecutor picks it up, takes it over, and prosecutes those charges in court. And so I'm focusing now on the second part. And in many ways, this is the bigger gap. Because across the board, Crown prosecutors refuse to prosecute offenses under First Nation laws. And I should say generally speaking, because there's exceptions to every rule. And they used to prosecute these charges, and they have stopped. And that is also a problem for enforcement, because a lot of the time, particularly First Nation police services say, I'm not going to bother laying charges because no one's going to prosecute them. So First Nations can hire their own prosecutors, but there's no funding for it. So we have a very big prosecution gap. So what are the impacts of all of this? First and foremost, it undermines self-government. Self-government can take a number of forms, and often it takes the form of drafting your own laws to govern your own lands, your own communities. But if those laws aren't enforced and there isn't prosecution, then again, they're just words on paper. And without prosecution, without enforcement, you can't bring those laws to life. Secondly, it also underlines community safety, and that's because these laws often relate to incredibly important community safety issues. For example, keeping dangerous individuals out of your community, or keeping illegal substances out with intoxicant laws or search laws. And if you can't enforce the law, you can't protect the community. And I've spoken to a number of chiefs who are incredibly frustrated with this situation. Overall, it creates an inequality. And that's because a lot of provincial laws don't apply on reserve. Residential tenancy laws, like landlord and tenant laws, don't apply on reserve. Environmental laws, land management laws. And so without First Nation laws being enforced, people living on reserve are stuck in a vacuum in a lot of cases. And so that means you don't have the same access to justice, you don't have the same access to rule of law as someone living in a town 20 kilometers down the road. And those sound like abstract concepts, but they have real impacts. It might mean you can't keep your children safe from dangerous individuals, you can't stop illegal dumping on your land, you don't have recourse if you get locked out of your home by a landlord, or the flip side of that, if your community owns a building and there is a dangerous and violent renter, you can't get them to leave. And more generally, you're subject to the settler laws that may not be appropriate, and you can't replace them with your own. So here's just a picture to illustrate what kind of issues we're dealing with. These are drugs seized at an airport by volunteer searchers, and the kinds of things that better enforcement of First Nation laws can help get off the street. And this is a photo of a pretty badly wrecked home in a First Nation. It's actually out in BC, this First Nation, but it's the same kind of issue. And the First Nation owned the house, they rented it out, the tenant was hostile, they were damaging the house, and the First Nation had to go all the way to court, and they had to hire a private prosecutor. And it was very expensive, it took a very long time, and by the time they got to the end of this process, the house was totally wrecked. And in the provincial context, there would be a straightforward process via an administrative tribunal. An important starting place for this discussion has to be Indigenous justice systems and a recognition that First Nations have inherent jurisdiction over justice issues. And that's critically important because we need to make sure that recommendations and discussions at the collaborative table are totally in line with support for Indigenous justice systems and revitalization of Indigenous justice systems. And when I say inherent, I mean flowing from each First Nation's own peoples, lands, and histories. I'm not talking about something coming from Section 35 of the Constitution. Section 35 of the Constitution recognizes something that's pre-existing. So a lot of First Nations want to build and run their own justice systems and will want to use Ontario's justice systems just as a stepping stone, just as an interim step. And we have to be very careful to keep that in mind. We're also talking about laws, not just bylaws, including in particular laws under inherent jurisdiction. And all kinds of laws have offenses, and you don't think about that because the laws are followed. So even laws that aren't criminal laws have offenses. For example, Ontario's child welfare law has, a dozen or so offenses in there. Those are important. They make sure that the law is followed. Part of the problem is that provincial and federal representatives often treat First Nation laws like they're municipal laws. I have a long slide on this, but I'm not going to read it because I'll just be preaching to the choir. And you know how inappropriate that is. And it's something that the government representatives need to be reminded of over and over. So when we were starting off the collaborative table process, we were very worried that the process was going to take too long and that we didn't want to wait for any progress while the table is ongoing. And so we recommended some immediate steps, and these were demanded by the Ontario Chiefs in Assembly back in November, Resolution 2137 that you've heard about. 2 items. One being funding for First Nations to hire their own prosecutors. And that's important because it gives you a lot more control over this process. And if you have Crown prosecutors only, the concern is that Crown prosecutors can act in essence as a gateway or as a gatekeeper. And if you have your own prosecutors, you can end up with someone who is has a lot better understanding of what your laws are, what the context is. But there's a second request, which is also to make Crown prosecutors available on request by First Nations, because not all First Nations are going to be able to or want to hire their own prosecutors, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So these are immediate steps that frankly should have happened at the beginning of this year, and steps that we have been pushing for. The request was reiterated to the ministers by Regional Chief Hare. It's been brought up at the collaborative table, and we have been told that we should expect a response soon, before too long, now that the election period is over and cabinet is getting reappointed provincially. But this is definitely a priority. In terms of enforcement, which was the focus of the first year of the table, these steps here outlined on this slide are some of the ways in which the enforcement gap could be reduced. The first one I touched on earlier, which is to make enforcement of First Nation laws mandatory for police services, and particularly the OPP. And again, Ontario's new policing law explicitly excludes First Nation bylaws from the list of mandatory police functions. That can change. Ontario is looking at regulations right now. They were doing that right before the election. That work got paused, and they're going to be jumping right back into it. And so that could be fixed, and that needs to be fixed. And it needs to be fixed so that the OPP can't say it's not our job, and so that First Nation police services are funded to do this work. Of course, resources are also needed for First Nations to develop their own enforcement mechanisms, to draft new laws. For example, you can use ticketing schemes, or you can use methods that involve penalties of withholding services, and you don't have to go to the settler courts at all. So some of those ways can happen if there's resources to make them happen. As well, resources for First Nation police services to help them address some charter and liability issues. And a complete overhaul of OPP policy is needed. They can't keep treating First Nation laws as being presumptively invalid and subject to a special kind of review process that doesn't happen for federal laws or provincial laws. And they need to end the practice of picking and choosing the laws that they like and don't like, and essentially acting as a gatekeeper who get to veto the laws that they don't like. Now, I assume that I'm running out of time here, so I'll just say one more thing. People always ask who's responsible. I'm going to say both governments are responsible for funding, because there's often a hot potato back and forth, and you can ask me questions about that because my time is running out. And lastly, I just want to say that there's much more work that's needed. We're moving on to prosecution as the next step soon in this year, and really trying to push on some of those immediate solutions, because we can't have a continuation of the status quo while we keep talking. Happy to answer any questions if there's time to do so. Miigwech. Oh.
Nyagawa for that, Kent, for the presentation, for outlining the work in detail that's been done to date with the table. So before we turn it over to the floor for comments or guidance to chiefs in attendance, I'd like to just make note of two items before we move to that. So the first is that we know that many of you have contacted COO asking how you can get involved or raise your community's specific enforcement issues. with the table. Just wanted to just to reiterate that this is a Tech Nations table. So it's not really a forum where our federal and provincial counterparts attend. So if you are interested, there is an opportunity for you. If there's an issue, to raise an issue, you can reach out to COO's acting Justice Director, Jackie Lombardi, who you heard from earlier, and she can chat with you one-on-one on how best to bring forward your concerns. So in second, before we move over to any questions, comments, is I know that there's a lot of information that was shared here today, and we've tried to do that quickly. So again, just wanted to say that if anyone wants a copy of the presentation, just reach out to Jackie. She'll ensure that you get that. And the co-chairs of the table have also produced a co-chairs report of the table's first year of work. And this was included in your meeting package and on your USBs, as well as it's on the Chief's meeting page for those who are attending virtually under documents. So in that report, you can find details about the table, and as well as the contact information that you need to get in touch with Jackie or the co-chairs. So with that, I will hand it over to Speaker Vera if she wants to field any questions or comments or concerns from the chiefs. Noah.
Thank you, Stacy. Is there any questions or comments from chiefs in assembly? Any questions or comments from chiefs in assembly or on the virtual platform? No hands up? Any questions, comments from chiefs in assembly? Microphone 4.
Bob Chiblamaba, Mississauga, number 8, First Nation. We're under the First Nation Land Management Act. We've got a lot of laws developed. Again, no mechanism to enforce them. So inherent jurisdiction, I'm seeing a lot of these phrases out there. What is the issue? Why did the provincial courts not want to take, because we've got bylaw officers that can, and we talked about, I heard people talk about trespassing, non-native trespassing on our lands. What is the reluctance from the province to enforcing our ticketing system if we chose to actually go ahead with that? We got ticket books all ready to go, but we use the Jaganash policing to issue trespassing items. What is the issue with the province not enforcing our laws that have been enacted and passed and all that kind of stuff? So can you tell us, Kent?
Yes, I'd be happy to speak to that. In one sense, the answer is very straightforward and simple in that they just need to provide the dollars to do it. On the other hand, the complicating factor is that if you are trying to create a system that is controlled more by yourself, you might want to have an internal ticketing system that only goes to the settler courts if push comes to shove. And you might want to develop a system that involves only your own enforcement officers and only your own prosecutors. But the two parts of it might be an internal ticketing process, and then if it needs to go to the next level, having enforcement and prosecutors.
Okay, we have not yet, but we're working on developing a justice circle. If the people that are trespassing are non-native off reserve, we have no mechanism to, we could try them by our justice circle, and that doesn't do anything if we want to say collect a fine or whatever that is. So and we may have all the internal structures in place, but no, outside our borders, they may not come back in or come in again. And since they know we have no mechanism to stop them, what's to stop them if we got nothing outside our territory to, you know, revoke their license or that kind of stuff that they do with the ministry, you know, so.
No, and it's good. Frankly, the more examples that we hear about today, all of them will go back to the federal and provincial representatives of how it's not working currently. And you would need to involve the courts there. And what you're talking about is exactly the same situation we're hearing across the province.
Thank you. Chief LaRocca on the virtual platform.
Yes. I mean, I just wondered, I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, but are there any pilot projects that are ongoing right now with enforcement of First Nation laws with communities in Ontario? I know some have expressed an interest from the lands management community side. I just wondered if there are any other pilot projects going on in the community.
I can speak to that in a little bit of detail, and if Deputy Grand Chief Loft has any other points, please add them. Currently, the Ministry of the Attorney General has a funding stream under its Indigenous Justice Division called the Revitalization of Indigenous Justice Systems, I believe. And in some cases, they have been funding small projects for enforcement and prosecution, but it's not nearly enough to actually solve the problem.
Thank you. Is there any other comments, questions?
3, please.
Microphone 3.
Tommy Fox, proxy for Chief Alex Batiste, Matachewan First Nation. I just wanted to touch base again on the eviction process for rentals. Once you go through the whole process with one individual, does that set precedence, or do you have to go through the process again with if it's another individual?
The problem is that the process to go through the court is too long and too expensive, and you would have to do it every time unless you develop your own internal system that is more efficient and faster. In some ways it's easier the second or the third time you do it, in that the court is more used to having a private prosecutor show up, but there is still a lot of benefit to setting up your own system.
Yeah, we went through the process once already and it was costly. I was just questioning it, that's all. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Any further questions, comments? Any further questions? Microphone 2. Ontario Regional Chief.
How, honey? Someone hit a nerve on me. I had to get up. Okay, good. You know, I've been chief number of years at home, and I went through hell, protecting my community, putting myself out there in the front line. When I hear this Trespass Act, it doesn't take Ottawa or the province for me to kick somebody out of my community. I did that. It stands today. We have a right as a chief to jump and protect our community and citizens, especially when there's loss of life. When people come into our communities, they're supposed to respect and be friendly and work with everybody and get along. But if they come in and kill our people, I would challenge anyone, Shagnash, government, if I evict somebody in my community, if there's a loss of life, there's just no fighting there for them. That's as a chief, to protect my citizens. I don't need no license act or nothing. It would help, yes, but I don't see any of that in the near future. Almost going 40 years now, and we're still trying to get some kind of bylaws, and they're just not picking it up. So in the area of trespass, I don't care who's speaking, like it's coming or working on it. We got mental health issues right now. We got people in Chiging right now that are shooting each other. Then people must not and should not come back in Chiging and your communities. Nobody will prosecute you, chiefs. Nobody. I'm not proud of what I done on the 3 matters that I dealt with. I'm not proud of it, but it's something I had to do, and nobody questioned me on it. Because that's our job, to protect our people when it comes under enforcement, whatever that means. The laws and bylaws that we have written, even though they're not recognized, it's the ones we write, it's the ones that we feel we can live with. And if they want to bless them tomorrow, I think we have probably hours, we'll just hand them here. This is what we want, not what you want. Because if they put that in there, certainly there's going to be strings attached to it. So I just wanted to vent that, because right now it's scary in our communities. We're dying. And it's not our people doing it to their own. It's scary. It's time to block that. And I hope and I know we will gain support from the general public of the country that we're taking steps. They kick our people out of the cities when they don't want them. Down the road, they take them to their city lines. They do that to us. But they do more than that in our community. They kill us. I'm not exaggerating. So again, chiefs, I just wanted to, I sit at these tables, I want to be vocal on these matters, and I'm not going to keep quiet, because it's a reality. And it's not precedent setting either. It's just, we have to do it. We got to do it. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Ontario Regional Chief. Microphone 4.
Miigwech. Chief McLeod. I met on Saturday in North Bay with the Attorney General, Honorable David Lametti, and spoke of these issues with him. We get into all kinds of agreements with the federal and provincial governments, mostly federal, when it comes to jurisdiction on First Nations. Like the Lands Management Act, First Nations management, lately the ANGA. We get into land claim settlements. And it seems like they use these, for promotional purposes for themselves as working with First Nations, but it's just, it doesn't go all the way, because they make these agreements where they're passing the jurisdiction back to us to create these laws within our First Nations, but don't follow it up with the mechanism to enforce them. So they're falling short on them. They make us, we'll get into these agreements with land claim to give us more land back to the First Nation, but we can't return it into First Nation reserve status. So they're good to, get these agreements signed, but not fulfill the obligations and the work necessary to 100% fully commit to those agreements that they sign with us. And Minister Lametti readily acknowledged that was a shortfall and didn't really have an answer other than to say that we need to keep pushing them. We need to keep every opportunity that we have to step up to the microphone and hold them accountable and keep pushing that they follow up on these so that we can actually put all of the jurisdiction back into First Nations' hand, including the adjudication process.
All right. Any other comments, questions from chiefs in assembly? Chief Miracle?
Thank you very much, Stacia and Kent, for the presentation. The federal government had in the Indian Act that the Attorney General could lay in information before the federal court to deal with trespass, but they've chosen not to do that. So when the government makes provision for federal authority to protect the rights and its responsibility of fiduciary relationship and doesn't do it, is there a cause of action against the federal court, the federal government? What good is putting it in the law to say we're never going to use it?
I think the kind of case, Chief Miracle, would more be along the lines of an equality case, as opposed to non-enforcement of a law. But
particularly trespass laws. And most of these things surround trespass of non-Indians on the reserve and violating the rights of our members who have a right to live there. So we do pass resolutions that the police do enforce, and usually if they're brought up in court, the council will pass a resolution asking these persons be prohibited from being on the reserve, and then when they go for their bail hearing, the judge invokes that condition on them. So if they come back on the reserve, then they're charged with being in contempt of their court order to not be there. That's the only way we've been able to do it, because the Attorney General does absolutely nothing other than avoid the issue.
And the argument being that you've asked them to do this, they've refused, and that's negligent.
And so really, I mean, you can have violent offenders, people that have committed serious crimes like physical assault, sexual assault. It can be dealing drugs, it can be murder, it can be a whole violence, thefts, you name it, drug dealing. And it's a menace to the community. And to me, I think the treaty obligation on the part of the Crown is that our community is supposed to be a safe and comfortable retreat for the people that live there. And if the Crown decides not to do anything to either make money available for First Nations to implement their own system, or alternatively enforce the law through the mechanisms that they have with the Crown Attorney, then to me, they're failing our people, and it's really another form of racism. That our people have no protection of law, and our community in no place is supposed to be devoid of law. But obviously, if the laws are not enforceable, then the reserves are devoid of law. Laws are only good if they can be enforced.
Thank you, Chief Miracle. And that being the last speaker, I don't have anybody on the virtual platform, so I want to thank you very much to our presenters. And thank you very much for listening, and we'll move on to the next agenda item with Winter Dawn.
Hello, everybody. So next on the agenda is the OFN-TSC update on housing and infrastructure. So I'd like to invite Chief Ardon Miracle, Chair of the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure, and Janet Gallant, OFN-TSC Senior Housing Policy Lead. And I'm told Janet will be joining virtually.
Sego Sawakwago. Bring greetings to everyone today from the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. And for many years, the Chiefs did not have a functioning committee. Chief Montour was the chair of it, and I think Chief Mitchell had been a former chair of it before. We did have representation, though, on the AFN Committee on Housing and Infrastructure to basically advocate for more resources and better standards for housing for our people. And it's one of the most urgent needs that our people have. I mean, no family can be healthy or safe if they don't have a roof over their head or if they don't have safe drinking water. And today in Canada, there are 34 First Nations still on boil water advisories, and 23 of them are in Ontario. So slide 1 and 2 have been up on the screen, and I'll ask for slide 3 to be put up. So the Assembly of First Nations submitted a pre-budget submission to ensure that the federal budget 2022-23 addressed First Nations housing needs. The total capital cost included in the pre-budget submission was $59.4 billion. It included $9.8 billion to deal with overcrowding, $21 billion for migration from urban back to the reserves, $3.8 billion for replacement units, and $4.5 billion for servicing new lots, $3.3 billion for repairs, and $15.7 billion for future needs. And currently in Ontario First Nations, there's only 726 lots available to build on. So this is one of the big issues with infrastructure that the chiefs raised during the discussions. Slide 4. As you can see in this diagram, Ontario has received between $58 million and $101 million per year in the federal housing funding over the past 5 years. In 2021, in 16-17, there was $101.5 million. In fiscal year 17-18, it fell down to $58.8 million. In fiscal year 18-19, it went up to $77 million. In fiscal year 19-20, $78 million. And fiscal year 2021, we're up to $76 million. So we've lost about $25 million a year since 2016-17. Slide 5. This slide shows the percentage of funding received by Ontario's First Nations allocation for closely follows Ontario's population of 23 or 24%, depending on the year. Slide 6. This slide shows the percentage of funding. This slide, slide 6. A First Nation housing data report was developed by the First Nations Information Governance Center. This report was based on a 2018 joint survey with AFN and the Indigenous Services Canada and the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation. The Ontario region had a high percentage of participation from First Nations. 102 First Nations of the 133 participated in this survey. That report reported that there was 8,645 housing units are required to meet the current housing needs. Going forward, 7,659 additional housing units are required to meet the need just in the next 5 years. A total number of 9,536 additional service lots are needed to meet the current housing needs, and currently Ontario has 726. 19.2% of the housing need replacing. 33.1% of individual housing need minor repairs. 33.92% need major repairs. Based on these findings, the estimated total cost to address First Nations housing needs in Ontario is roughly $4.4 billion. Slide 7. The federal allocation for First Nations housing does not come close to the $59 billion pre-budget submission put forward by the AFN. Canada has roughly allocated $3 billion over 5 years to close the housing gap. It's a drop in the bucket. $2.4 billion over 5 years to support First Nation housing on reserves, $565 million over 5 years to support housing in First Nations self-governing and modern treaty holder communities, $300 million over 5 years to launch an urban, rural, northern, and Indigenous housing strategy. Rough estimations suggest that Ontario will receive an additional $100 million a year in housing over the next 5 years. Coupled with the current funding levels, that makes the total allocation for Ontario approximately $170 million per year going forward. As previously mentioned, the housing backlog in Ontario is $54.4 billion. At the current rate of expenditure, it would take 20 years to fill the current housing backlog, assuming there's no increase in demand or growth in population. Funding will be provided for housing infrastructure through the AIP Child Welfare Agreement, which we heard about yesterday, and the class action lawsuit. However, this additional funding won't do much to close the gap, and I'm not certain that this is really additional funding or whether it's just funding, existing funding reclassified. I did send Jody Nibbs a response, which I sent to Chris Hoyos today, and we'll be looking into that for clarity later this week. A report was developed this month by the Senate Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, and it's titled "The Effects of Housing Shortages on the Indigenous People in Canada." It made 20 recommendations in this report that was tabled in the Standing Committee this past week. Recommendation 18, it says that in order to achieve the objective of closing the infrastructure gap in First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and communities by 2030, as outlined in the mandate letter from the Minister of Indigenous Services, the federal government revises its housing investment strategy, since the target will not be met if the current pace is maintained, and these are the instructions. By the end of February 2023, the federal government provide a detailed plan outlining projected investments from 2022 to 2030 to address the gaps. And this is the gap for First Nations housing, Métis, and Inuit. And I am concerned that we might be competing with these other groups for that housing money that's going to be put in that investment plan. We need our own separate strategy. Slide 10, what is transfer and care and control? With the previously stated housing needs in mind, we would like to switch gear to another major issue in the Housing and Infrastructure Committee. Indigenous Services Canada is mandated to transfer control of housing and infrastructure programs and services to First Nations. In short, the idea is for First Nations or First Nations organizations to deliver their own programs and services based on transfer agreements with ISC. COO has been provided funding to engage in a way forward for First Nations in Ontario, including scope of whatever they wish to take over. Slide 11. What is transfer and care and control? This diagram on the slide shows that what ISC envisions the transfer to look like. First, the development of proof of a concept. Second, would come negotiations and institution building, and third, implementation. This is not necessarily the path Ontario First Nations have to take, but this is what is being proposed. Slide 12. Chiefs of Ontario mandate. The Chiefs in Ontario Assembly passed Resolution 2010, mandating COO and the Chiefs Committee on Housing Infrastructure to conduct engagement regarding the transfer and care and control of housing to First Nations in Ontario. COO received funding from ISC to undertake this project. Slide 13. Engagement on transfer of care and control. In 2021, the Chiefs of Ontario developed a series of workshops for leaders and technicians on the following topics. On May the 28th, there was an introductory workshop on the National Housing Strategy. On June the 24th, the immediate housing infrastructure needs was discussed. July the 22nd, they looked at data and governance. August the 24th was financing and economic development. The engagement culminated with a Housing Sovereignty Summit on October the 14th. The engagement on transfer and care and control continued. Slide 14. Throughout the 4 workshops and summit, a number of common themes were identified. Entitled What We Heard report was developed and provided to the Chiefs and Assembly for their review in the Fall 2021 Special Chiefs Assembly. A copy has already been forwarded on your ISB information packages. Slide 15. Options paper development process. Included in your packages is an options paper for the transfer of care and control of housing for First Nations in Ontario. The option paper was developed as a joint effort between the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation, Chiefs of Ontario, and the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. The Chiefs and Assembly are not, and I must say, are not being asked to make a decision today. This is a first draft, and we will be using the summer and fall to engage further on these options before bringing them before the Chiefs and Assembly in the fall. So it's information purposes at this stage. Chiefs that attended the housing workshop were clear that transfer would not be feasible until certain criteria are met. These prerequisites include filling the backlog to ensure First Nations are not put in a position where they are simply managing their own misery and poverty. Ensuring the required infrastructure is in place to keep pace with the housing stock increases, including sufficient service lots with access to hydro, electrical, roads, sewage, and so on. Policy and structure changes are required to ensure First Nations are able to meet their housing needs. This includes revision of the ATR policy and municipal tax regimes. Slide 17. Ideas forward include a centralized housing office. Please note that the OpenSTC and COO have tried to put forward a full spectrum of options before the Chiefs and Assembly. Even if some options may be unpopular, it was decided to still include them to show the range of possibilities. The first option is centralized Ontario Regional Housing Office model. This includes the development of centralized housing regional housing office, responsible for negotiating Ontario's funding allocation with ISC and distributing housing funds to Ontario First Nations. More information on this model, including benefits and challenges, can be found in the options paper. Slide 18, regional housing organizations would have Board of Representatives model. Second, the Regional Housing Organization Board of Representatives model includes housing organizations located throughout the province. Membership of these organizations would be based on whatever groupings First Nations leaders see fit. This could be geographic area, a PTO affiliation, or large First Nations could have their own first organization. Each regional housing organization would negotiate funding relationships directly with ISC and would independently deliver their own programs and services. The model consists of a board of representatives made up of representatives from each of the regional housing organizations, and the board would be responsible for the development of goals, strategies for the advocacy at the Ontario level. Slide 19. Regional Housing Organizations Resource Hub Model. The Regional Organization Resource Hub model is similar to the Board of Representatives model with a few added organizational components at the Ontario regional level. In addition to the board representatives, the model includes a resource hub with mechanisms at its disposal to support regional housing organizations. The resource hub would focus on services that would benefit most from an Ontario regional level approach, including training for housing managers, financial literacy resources, advocacy tools, data collection and storage. The roles and responsibility of the resource hub would be determined by the Board of Representatives and would fill gaps in capacity at the regional level. The regional organization, slide 20, the centralized approach is similar to the previously discussed models, but has no overarching organizational structure. In this model, regional housing organizations would act completely independent of each other and would develop linkages between each other and in an informal manner. And option 5 is to simply maintain the status quo. ISC and CMHC would continue to provide housing programs and services for the foreseeable future. 21, slide 21, the next steps. COO, an Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation, will be reaching out directly to Leadership Council members, organizations, and First Nations for further feedback on the options papers throughout the summer and fall of 2022. Final approval of the options paper will be sought from the Leadership Council in mid-fall 2022. The options will be submitted to the Chiefs and Assembly in the fall of 2022 Special Chiefs Assembly for a decision on how to proceed with this idea of transfer and control of housing in Ontario. Final remarks, as mentioned previously, no decision on transfer of care and control will be made without the Chiefs and Assembly. I'm going to put it up here. The Chiefs of Ontario does not see a role for itself in becoming a housing authority or dictating housing funding levels for First Nations. ISC has stated that there are no set timelines, and this can be addressed at a pace determined by the First Nations. Many leaders that we spoke to have taken the position that a lot of work needs to be done before a transfer of care and control can be negotiated. This may include filling the housing backlog, which could take many, many years. One of the other issues that came forward in the report was that the majority of First Nations do not have any kind of asset management program in place to address the housing stock in their communities. And 65% or so don't have an updated capital plan that addresses the housing needs in their communities. There is a lack of data to marshal a strong case forward for the Ontario region. And it's very important that, that the First Nations cooperate in a collective approach to gather what the needs are so that the chiefs can assemble a strong data to deal with especially the backlog that's growing in leaps and bounds each year. And there's serious underinvestment of federal resources. And so the other danger that I see is that if we're competing against the Métis and the Inuit for the First Nations pot of money, if they go forward and Canada develops a model that everybody goes to this one pot of money, it could lead to problems for our community, a lot of infighting with the other organizations. So I think we need to pull up our socks and have our own separate approach and advocacy with the federal government to deal with this whole issue. And it's sad, you know, when you see that children are taken into care because there is, you know, they don't have a house. Affordability is becoming a larger issue in the urban center and on reserves. There's a lack of supply, rising costs, market conditions are impacting the ability of First Nations to build the houses. They'll have less houses because of the market conditions, and all these things are really working against us. And so there needs to be strong advocacy on the part of us all to fulfill this very basic need for our people for safe housing and safe drinking water, so that our people can live and thrive in their communities. That's my report. Thank you so much. No, go.
Thank you, Chief Miracle, for your presentation. There's lots to consider. At this point in time, I'd like to invite the chiefs and audience to break if they need to, but we're going to keep going to allow for a few quick preliminary questions and comments to keep the agenda moving. As Chief Miracle indicated, further discussion is required, and in the interest of time, I suggest tabling a little bit more of the in-depth discussions for those spaces. But at this time, if there are any questions or comments, please either raise your hand virtually or step up to the mics. Chief Shining Turtle?
Yep. Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation, Chief Miracle. Where to begin with all of this? I think with the Chiefs of Ontario, there was never any project management to ever drive any of the change, going back to the Chief of Six Nations that had the housing file, Chief Montour. I remember we hosted the All Ontario, Whitefish River hosted the All Ontario at our new hotel, and he came up and said absolutely nothing, because he said nothing's been done. And I think that was back in 2008 or 29 or 09. And he just threw up his hands and said, you guys don't want to deal with this. So there's been attempts at different levels. I tried very hard to get things going. There was never any project management to drive the type of change we needed to see at the Chiefs of Ontario level. The next thing we met, you were at the meeting that we met in Ottawa with the deputy minister, and he was very excited about motivating change with housing if we had a plan. Ontario had a plan, and that was back 4 or 5 years ago. We came back and presented that to the chiefs, and no plan came from that. So it appears that we have a project management crisis on our hands. We just can't get to the stage where we can plug in the type of data that's needed. And it's going to get in our way, unfortunately. I would say this, one, we have to have a self-determined plan. And I think that's what will separate us from the other groups that are competing for these precious dollars. I think that's terribly important that we exercise our authority in that area. Secondly, there are protracted legacy issues I've talked about for years. The old section, what was it, the CMHC, section 56, the 56-1 program was devastating to First Nations with the CMHC program. Then there was the old Indian housing program from Indian Affairs. Just devastated First Nations. So where we find ourselves is not at the hands of our own doing, but at the hands of failed policy, full stop. I think there's some fiduciary responsibility that we have to exercise here as well, not just walk away from that so lightly. It's imperative that we hold the Crown accountable under their fiduciary duty to First Nations and us for housing and all the other things we've been doing, because clearly, as the chief has indicated, there is abject suffering in our communities in every area. Every topic that we've talked about today, yesterday, and tomorrow, and a week from now, 10 weeks from now, it's all around the suffering, and our people are suffering, and it's real. Next, they are trying to do the best they can. But what's happening, we're eroding the trust in our own communities, in our organizational structure, all these different pieces. There's just an erosion of trust. So people start doing things onto their own. And sometimes that's maybe the right thing to do, but often it has its consequences. Third, we all need each other. And I want to thank Chief Marco for saying that, because this needs to be said over and over again. We will only succeed if we collectively take this problem on. Otherwise, we're going to get caught up in the prop washing, and there'll be these one-off projects. These and you've all seen these things occur. We need to stop doing that. It has not bore any fruit for us anywhere along the line, and we find ourselves where we are today. Next, there was a letter submitted to every band council in April. A copy of Chief Marco's letter was out in April. I got mine in April, and it asked us to roll up your capital needs. And that's due at the end of this month. I asked the Chiefs of Ontario to resend that out to make sure that every First Nation knew about that. This opportunity has come before us. It's imperative that we get those roll-ups in. It's imperative. I think they want to get this rolled up by August and bring a number forward for cabinet submission, and it's going to be a staggering number. I suggest it's going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, because that's how far we're behind. So it's imperative that each chief and council dig into this data with either your tribal council, your own housing units, or your infrastructure folks, and start rolling up the information and get that in. The more data we put in there, the better the argument is to go forward. And it supports recommendation 18. But it has to be self-determined, which is the resolution I'm bringing forward this week, talking about those capital requirements, that we have to drive this further. We have to empower the chiefs of Ontario to take this on. We can't just leave it to us. We have to put this engine together to say, no, we need to be involved in this discussion at every step of the way now, walk it right through the cabinet submission so that there is a closing of the gap once and for all. And it's not just language that just becomes rhetoric for every discussion that we have, because it's just been piecemeal for far too long. And it's been damaging to every family and every community member that we see in our streets. The suffering is absolutely real and it's critical. The next phase, we should also take this to the AFN, the same resolution that we passed this week. We should take that to the AFN and empower them to push hard. Beyond the budget submission, which I felt was light, that it was at least a try, 53 billion. I think in Ontario, you're going to find we need that and more in one province. Then you have to lay out a plan, a 10-year plan, but we got to get this resolution through. We have to put our data in. I'm imploring every leader to bring in your data. Bring in your data. The AFN, let's take that next step and empower the resolution that we pass here to get that exercise so that we start pressurizing the government. Then we need to lobby. We need to lobby. We need to lobby. We can't leave this to Chief Maracle. We can't leave this to the Coon Committee. We can't leave this. We need to get into Ottawa. We need to get in the face of government. When is the last time we've done that, folks? It's time we go to Ottawa and we say, no, we're not leaving here until we get this embedded. We need to come back to our communities and bring hope. Not hopelessness, but hopefulness for a future. I was reading some documents today, and it talked about the Great Father protecting my family, my children. You heard me say that this isn't a great spirit that pointed out to me to imitate him. And this is the reason why the coat of the British nation is red. And as the sun will continue to appear to you, so my coat shall never be out of your sight. What does this mean? It means this. The relationship articulated is one in which Indigenous people would always be provided by the Great Father. And this, they would never sink in poverty. Never sink in poverty. The opportunity we have before us is short. This Liberal and NDP alliance will not last long. If we don't embed the structural change and infrastructure gap in the next year, that window is going to close on us. There's an election coming, and we see change on the horizon. Inflation is out of control because of geopolitical consequences that we cannot control. But our people are suffering at the hands of inflation. And we need to say something about that. We need to take control of those reins. So this window is very short on us. The current government's been elected in blue in Ontario. You know what that's going to mean. When, it's not if, it's when Conservatives get elected in Ottawa that we're going to see some real change. And if I had to spitball just looking a little bit further ahead, in the next year to 18 months, we're going to be faced with another crisis on our hand. And that's going to be a recession. And all the markers are there for a recession. And now you're going to have a recession, you're going to have a change in government, and we're going to look back at this as a failed opportunity. I implore you to join all of us in bringing about a final closure in this sad chapter of our history. Let's finally close this infrastructure gap. I applaud Chief Maracle for his leadership and his tenure in trying to see this through. And I call on all of our chiefs, let's take this next step. Let's boldly go where we had to go anyways, into our hands. Go the fate of our future. Miigwech Bizindoyak.
The other thing I wanted to mention was that Siva Apia is the housing manager at Indian Affairs, Indigenous Services Canada, I should say. And he has an expression of interest call out, which will, he wants to be in by June the 24th, what your housing needs are. So please do apply. If your community needs a Zoom call session or a Teams call or something like that, just give him a call and he'll organize it to get information that your housing people need to put in an application. And so there is some, looks like there's going to be some resources, but again, the resources that are available in the Ontario region don't even come close to meeting the demand that's currently there in the backlog in housing. And so I think if we all band together, we have a better chance of being successful. And I guess we also have to, the Open STC is developing a data management system. So we have data that we can carry out a successful lobby based on current good information. So maybe Janet Gallant could speak to that, the work that they're doing.
All right, I'd just like to reiterate that if anybody needs to step out for a quick break, just take a moment. But if there are any other final questions or comments, we can take that at this time. Seeing none, I'd like to invite Speaker Adam up for our next agenda item.
Just give them 6 minutes.
Thank you very much for that presentation. So I think we've got about 5 minutes to 3. We had allocated 3 o'clock National Chief Roseanne Archibald to be here. So what I'm going to do is get everybody to stand up, take a break, take a stretch, look around, say Anin, Bonjour, Wajé. Now don't leave the room. I see 2 leaving the room. I see 3. I'm counting. I see you. So we are going to take a little stretch, and then we will have National Chief join us very shortly. We'll be back in about 3 minutes. Don't go far. I would have gone if you heard. I think that's wrong. So that's the order I wasn't sure. So the original, and then the 2, and then one, and then you know, that's where I get. Oh, I know you're not confused. So just as long as you know. Like not, it's like 2:45. So those ones that are starting. See, the one he's asking for is already in. Oh, it's already in. Yeah. Oh, right. Yes. Okay. And then we start with as long as you know. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to conclude. That's the way I am. Yeah. These ones everybody's going to have. So yeah, just see that extension. I said nobody leave, everybody left.
Yeah. They don't really
Are you up? Who's introducing the minister?
So I'm doing national chief and then Vera.
Okay, so I'll get them to print that,
Yeah.
because they want, we'll give them a proxy to speak first.
Before the minister?
No, after you introduce her.
Okay.
I'm gonna get him, to get him to print that out.
Yeah, that printout would
Yeah.
be better.
There you go. We get a lot of those. Yeah, no, they want the right? I mean, we get those requests all the time. Some of them are like, borderline. People that like just haven't done their research. Oh yeah. And so some of them we get through that have a little more educated questions, like a little more specific and more broad. We'll entertain that a little bit more, and then go to our speed. Yeah. Well, no, the numbers went up. The numbers went up from this morning to now. We were at. That's probably it. And then I do. And on the. She's trying to. But yeah, we had 44 this morning. Now we have 46. They might be going, leaving and then going back. That actually might help us. Like, if they want to be early, they go back. Oh, right. Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
So we are ready to reconvene. If I can have chiefs back into the assembly room, please, and back to the tables. And I'm going to ask if we can cut out the discussion. I have to be as direct as Ogama Pelche. I don't know how to do that. So I'm hoping we're back on, the live feed is on, I'm hoping. It is, very good. And we're still on the virtual session, so we've got chiefs and delegates joining us on Zoom. So we'd like to get underway. Again, discussions are taking place. If I can have quiet in the room, please. Shh. Thank you. Miigwech. So next on the agenda, we do have, we had it at 3 o'clock. So we do have the next speaker after this is Minister of Indigenous Services, Haidu. We have her booked at 3:45. So we'll go right to National Chief Roseanne Archibald, who will make a presentation. And I'm hoping there will be some time for any questions or comments from the floor as well as the virtual platform. So with that, I'd like to welcome National Chief Roseanne Archibald. You got you.
Lord Seamus, Roseanne Archibald, Nitishnagastan, I'm really happy to be here with you today. And I do have a request that I've talked to Chief Dean Sayers about with respect to some discussions we're going to have today. And so I'd like to maybe have Chief Sayers say a few words. Microphone 4.
Miigwech Shigama. Thank you, National Chief. Ogama Namanagojing Alkasid, Chief Dean Sayers, Batchwana First Nation. I just wanted to welcome you first of all, and also let the chiefs know that there will be some delicate matters that will be brought to our attention this afternoon, and I would support us moving in camera for a good portion of the National Chief's presentation to us today. So I would be prepared to move to have us move in camera, and I believe there was another chief that was also prepared to help out with this process.
Miigwech. So there is a motion. We have a mover to go in camera for this session. Microphone 4, is that a second?
Yeah, Bob Chiblo.
Okay, thank you very much. So we do have a motion on the floor to go in camera. Can I get some indication? I'm not calling for a formal vote, but can I get some indication whether there's support to go in camera? So I do see a hand up. Are we okay going in camera? I do see support to go in camera. So thank you very much. I'm not sure how much in camera. There's various levels.